Hey, this is Jason Molina. It's my great pleasure to be interviewing George Packer, the author of The Assassin's Gate, out now and paperback on FSG. George, how are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing great. What was it that made you, as an essayist and a writer, decide that you needed to go to Iraq in order to report on this war?
I had been thinking about Iraq, talking about Iraq, writing about Iraq for at least a year before the war, mainly because I have a close Iraqi friend named Kanan Makia, who's a writer and intellectual, wrote a book called Republic of Fear, which is probably the best book about the regime of Saddam Hussein. And through Kanan, I got extremely interested in and obsessed with even the idea of an Iraq war and the preparations and the arguments over the war, both for and against. I mean, it just consumed me for that whole long, anxious year before we invaded Iraq. Kanan Makia became a key player. He became one of the Bush administration's sort of highest profile Iraqi advocates for the war. He gave it a real kind of moral seal of approval based on his passion for human rights and democracy in Iraq. And in that sense, Kanan went way out on a limb for the Bush administration. And part of what interested me was his dilemma as an individual, as a thinker. He has high ideals, but he made the decision to enter the world of ugly, hard, dirty politics because he felt it was the only way he could get his dream achieved, which was a democratic Iraq. And I watched him over the course of that year forced to make all the compromises and tough decisions you have to make when you enter the political fray. It just interested me on a human level, on a moral level. Once the war happened, I felt I had to go over there to see what was going on. I needed to make it real for myself because I'd spent so much time thinking about it, wondering, arguing with myself and others, that the only thing to do seemed to be to go over and actually report on it and talk to Iraqis and Americans who were in Iraq and find out what was really happening.
So let's talk a little bit about the post-war Iraq planning. I noticed that this book was not all about George Bush. When I picked up this book, I was expecting that it would be either a blame book or a Bush as hero book. I find that George Bush is not really a key player in this.
You're absolutely right. Bush is not the leading character in The Assassin's Gate. One reason is I don't have access to him either personally or psychologically. To me, he's a somewhat opaque character, whereas others who I actually was able to meet and talk to, or else talk to others about them, people like Paul Wolfowitz and Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, interested me more and seemed more involved in just the day-to-day and week-to-week planning, fighting, infighting in the lead up to the war.
Do you think that under any president, this war was going to happen?
I don't think so. I think that this war was uniquely this administration's. It would not have happened under a President Al Gore. It would not have happened under a President George H.W. Bush. It would not have happened under President Bill Clinton. The reason it happened was twofold. One, September 11th set the stage for a total overhaul, a total revision of American foreign policy in the Bush administration. And two, there were people around the president who for a long time had had their eyes on Iraq as an enemy that needed to be dealt with, and who also had a certain vision of America's role in the world that was more aggressive, more ambitious, more willing to use force, more willing to go it alone than probably any other group of advisors in American history. They happened to be the people that George W. Bush chose to surround him with. They were there on September 11th, and when he needed a kind of a guide to the strange new world that began on September 11th, they had one. They were the first people to him with a kind of a plan. We know how to deal with this, and the way to deal with it is to attack not just the terrorists, but the states that we claim are supporting them, and to do it with our military might, and to do it in a way that basically says we will uphold the values and standards of good in the world, regardless of what our allies think. We know we're good. We know America is a force for good in the world, and therefore we can use our power in the interests of the good without worrying about what other people think. There's a kind of a simplified version of the foreign policy of the people around the president and his foreign policy. He got the advisors he wanted, and on September 11th and in the days afterward, very quickly, Iraq came into their sights. It would not have happened, I think, if any other likely contender had been in the Oval Office on that day. Although Bush is not the leading character in my book, the character of the president is always crucial. And what's evident in my telling of the story about Bush's character is he has a kind of a blind faith in himself and his own ideas and ideals. He doesn't question them, and he doesn't want them to be questioned. And there's a series of scenes in The Assassin's Gate where someone comes into his office potentially with some bad news or some information that's going to undermine Bush's optimism and confidence. And in each of those scenes, what happens is Bush lets the person know that he doesn't want to hear it. One of them is Jay Garner, who was the first leader of the occupation government in post-war Iraq. He only lasted a few weeks because chaos was raging all around him. When he was sent back to Washington, he met the president in the Oval Office along with Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, and Dick Cheney. And here was a chance, very early on in the occupation, for the president to find out what was really going on in Iraq from his man in Iraq. Tell me the worst, Jay. What do we need to worry about? What's up ahead? Instead, according to Garner, who gave me an account of the conversation, their 45 minutes essentially consisted of slapping each other on the back and telling each other what a wonderful job everyone was doing. And at the end of the conversation, the president sort of jokingly said, "So do you want to do Iran for the next one?" And Garner replied, "No, sir, me and the boys are holding out for Cuba." And the president said, "All right, you can have Cuba." And it was all very much in good fun. And what should have happened, that is, the truth should have been told to the president, didn't. And I think it's because the president let Garner know that he wasn't interested in hearing bad news. And that's the character of the president as it plays out across the story of the Iraq War.
I'm going to hit you with a quote from The Assassin's Gate. This is a quote from the Central Criminal Court judge that you interviewed. And he says, "If I stay at home and you stay at home and the other guy stays at home, who will build Iraq?" Can you talk a little bit about what you think it is to build Iraq?
Well, the people who planned the war had a series of assumptions that they made, and they were basically worst-case assumptions about Iraq as a threat. That is, they have WMD, they have a nuclear program well underway, they have connections to al-Qaeda. Who knows, but in a year we might actually be on the receiving end of a nuke that is postmarked Baghdad. That was the worst-case assumption about the threat. About Iraq's potential in the future, without Saddam, they had the best-case assumptions, which was essentially that Iraq was a country of educated, middle-class people, not religiously fanatic, not tribally or ethnically divided, that would be a model for the rest of the Middle East once it was relieved of this burden of Saddam Hussein, that a thriving, economically prosperous democracy would not be a difficult achievement in Iraq because the Iraqi people were capable of it. This is what Paul Wolfowitz said over and over, and he spoke with a sort of authority as if he actually knew a lot of Iraqis. And he was once asked, what if they have an election and they elect an Islamic regime? He answered, I don't think that's going to happen. 50% of them are women. women don't want to suffer under an Islamic government. Among the other 50%, I happen to know a lot of them, men, and the ones I know don't want it either. This was just the staggering naivete and ignorance and overconfidence that represented the position of everyone who was in a place to make a difference in the administration. There were other people who were warning that it would not be easy, that Iraq was divided, that its economy was shattered by war and sanctions, and that the Iraqi people had gone backwards under Saddam Hussein, and that it would take years and billions of dollars and a long-term American presence and international help just to keep Iraq from falling to pieces. The people who were saying this were shut out of the decision-making, consciously, systematically shut out. So the best-case assumptions were the ones that we went into Iraq with, and within something like days of the fall of Baghdad, they were all in pieces. They were rubble, because without an American effort to secure the country, without enough troops and a proper strategy for securing the country, Iraqis set about, many of them, to loot and destroy their own institutions, which they hated because they associated them with Saddam. So by the end of May 2003, we were in a very deep hole, which we have never been able to dig our way out of. It happened that fast, and it's because we went in with wrong ideas, underprepared, under-resourced, and above all, sort of convinced that if our intentions were good, then good things would follow, whereas history tells us that that doesn't always happen.
Basically, I look at this book after I read it as a series of essays where the author is clearly moving around. You aren't in Iraq the entire book. You aren't at home the entire book. But you introduce us to some fantastic and really deep characters who show up several times, and the poignancy of your interactions with them can't be overstated.
Well, thank you.
I would like you to introduce us to Asil, if you could.
Well, Asil is a young Iraqi woman who lives in Baghdad. When I met her, she was working at the University of Baghdad as a computer programmer.
George, did she literally stop you in the street?
I was at the University of Baghdad to cover the last days of another of the main characters of the book, Drew Erdman, who was a State Department official, young guy in his mid-30s, who had gone over to Baghdad as a volunteer to help in the rebuilding of the country, and found himself pretty quickly in charge of the Ministry of Higher Education at age 35. This was the nature of the American occupation. It was pretty haphazard, pretty ad hoc. He was one of the very good ones, but he went back to Washington after 3 months. And on his last day, he went to the University of Baghdad to say goodbye to his colleague there, the president of the university. And while we were there, I was walking down a hallway with him when two young women wearing sort of cream-colored veils literally blocked our path as we were walking and said in English, in rather simple English, "We must go out of Iraq. Can you help us?" They were essentially putting their hopes and dreams into Drew's hands and saying, "We need freedom. Yes, the old regime is gone, but we're living in chaos. There are Baathists still in our office. There are gunmen on the street who are abusing and even killing women for not wearing the veil. We want new experiences."
She says a fantastic quote from the book is, "I can move around and it's a big jail."
Yeah, she was telling me that her freedom was not real freedom. She didn't feel free inside. I mean, one of the reasons was that her boss was a Ba'ath Party member, a woman who still kept a picture of Saddam Hussein in the office. She just had the frame turned toward the wall. This was, Asil felt still imprisoned. This was a young woman who had taught herself English by watching American movies on DVD. Nicole Kidman was her favorite actress, and Sharon Stone was another of her favorites. And she learned English by watching these movies, and she became something of an Americophile. And more than that, though, she had a real idea of the kind of society she wanted to live in. It would be a free society, whereas she once said to me, I could ride a bicycle around Baghdad and nobody would care. I mean, that's the sort of simple thing that she wanted and that she couldn't have. And that, unfortunately, and this is the real tragedy, after the fall of Saddam, she lost many of her freedoms because of the violence and the insecurity. She was nearly kidnapped once. She had to cover her hair, something she'd never done before. She had to worry about what she said and who she talked to, and even being seen with me was somewhat dangerous for her. I was just very taken with her from the moment I met her and just wanted to find out more about her life. She took me back to her house to meet her family, and they became some of my best friends. And over the next 2.5 years, as I kept returning to Iraq to cover the progress or lack of progress in the war, I always made a point of going to see a SEAL to find out how she was doing, because the first time I met her, the last thing she said to me as I left her house was, "Do you think my dreams will come true?" And that sort of haunted me for the 2 or 3 years afterward, and I wanted to know if her dreams could come true. And so I kept going back to see her, and in fact, some of her dreams have begun to come true, others have not. But she's one of the really very admirable and inspiring people I met in Baghdad who are part of the story of my book.
I want to talk about John Pryor. You talk about meeting some soldiers. John is also an extraordinary character. His stories do jive with real soldiers' stories that I've spoken to friends of mine who have read this book.
Well, Captain John Pryor, when I met him, was 29. He's from Indiana. He was ROTC at a small engineering college in Indiana. He thought the Army was going to be his career. When I met him, he was the commander of an infantry company that was responsible for an area of South Baghdad that consisted of about 250,000 people, responsible for security, for trash, sewage, electricity, water, all the services. He had his hands full. And one of the themes of my book is how great historical events, whether tragic or not, have a way of making people larger than themselves. You're absolutely right. The soldiers you meet in Iraq are very much a cross-section, not of all of America, to be honest, but of predominantly small-town America, rural America, middle America, although the coasts are obviously represented. And John fits that perfectly. But when you meet them in Iraq and when you see the work they're doing and the kind of difficulties that they put up with as a matter of course, and I don't want to idealize them too much because some of them, frankly, are jerks, but many of them, including John Pryor, sort of rose to the occasion. They knew that they were involved in something historic, and it brought out not always the best in them, but the most in them. I think it was true of many Iraqis as well. I had the feeling whenever I went back there that this was just a gigantic drama. I didn't know how it was going to end, but I did know that it involved the most important issues in people's lives and that the stakes were incredibly high. And John Pryor seemed to know that too, because he made a point, really without being told to do it or trained to do it, because the military did not prepare the soldiers for the occupation of Iraq. They thought they'd be out of there within a few months. Instead, as we all know, they're still there. John Pryor understood that this war would be won or lost in the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people, that capturing and killing insurgents or terrorists was not the way to victory. The way to victory was to show Iraqis some benefits from the American presence. And so he worked his heart out on issues like sorting out the lines at the local gas station, making sure that cooking gas was being distributed properly, making sure that the rebuilding of the sewage system in this slum in South Baghdad, where he was based, was going to succeed. He once said to me, this is all about nation building, and nation building is all about sewage. So the Iraq War is all about sewage. I mean, he got it. He understood that this was not a conventional war, that we had not won just because we had gotten rid of Saddam Hussein. He was one of the soldiers, and I constantly met them at that kind of mid-level of lieutenant, captain, major, lieutenant colonel, who just intuitively understood what kind of conflict they were in, and that it was an unconventional one, and it was really a conflict for people's minds. Whereas at the top levels, both military and civilian, I always found that they really were less aware, less informed, and less willing to face the hard facts of our mistakes and failures in Iraq. If it had been up to the guys at the level that John Pryor served at, I think we would have had a much better outcome. But unfortunately, they were working in a chain of command, and at the top of that chain of command, there were officials, and I would point to Donald Rumsfeld above all, who either didn't understand or didn't want to understand the nature of the Iraq War, and on whom the blame for the tragedies that have happened over the past 3 years really does rest.
Well, the kind of initiative that that John really takes is very informative to me as a watcher of this debacle. I'm really proud to know that there are people who are able to see a situation and take care of it in a way that really isn't all about muscle.
I mean, make no mistake, over the course of the year, he got very frustrated. And when I last saw him in Iraq, June of 2004, his unit had been there for 15 long, hard, dangerous months. They had actually literally been turned around on their way to the airport when it turned out that they could not be sent home because a conflict had just broken out across the whole country and the troops were needed to fight it. So they were there for a long time. And when I last saw him in Iraq, he and his men were no longer in Baghdad. They were in a very tough town called Mahmudiyah, south of Baghdad. They were being mortared almost every night at their base. They were being bombed on the roads and getting very unfriendly looks from the local people when they went out on patrol. They were just counting the days before they could go home. And not from Pryor himself, because John remained an idealist to the end, but from some of the guys around him, I began to hear very cynical comments about the Iraqis, about their religion, about their inability to progress, to be trustworthy, to work hard. And you could see that this long confinement together, American soldiers and Iraqis, which was becoming more and more violent over the course of that year, was taking a real toll on their spirits. So I don't want to suggest that all was cooperation and high spirits. It was an extremely difficult year for them, and I think by the end, many of them felt that it had not been a success, that they were watching the violence increase, the attitude of Iraqis turning sour, their own attitudes turning somewhat sour. So it was just as you must know from talking to your friends who've served, it's a real cauldron, literally. I mean, in the summertime, it's 130 degrees in some parts of Iraq, and they're wearing heavy body armor and equipment. So it's one of the toughest assignments any American soldiers have ever had anywhere.
Let's talk about Memorial Day. You go to Des Moines. Can you introduce us a little bit to the private's father that you get to know, and a little bit about what it was that made you go to Des Moines, and was that similar to what it was that made you go to Iraq?
Well, what you're hitting on is kind of the thing that really drove the writing of this book, which was mainly my interest in these people, these individuals. I mean, obviously the war, the policies, the ideas are the framework, but the heart of the book are these characters. And I had in mind a novel as the form of the book, in which one would follow the lives of individuals who find themselves caught in this huge historical event, but who remain essentially themselves as they are changed by it, and whose lives in some cases intersect. So I wanted it to read like a novel, even though all of it is true. The family you're referring to, the Froscheisers, are from Des Moines. Kurt Froscheiser was just a kid. I mean, he was 22 years old, had been delivering pizzas just a few months earlier when he decided to enlist in the Army. He told his father, Chris, that he wanted to be part of something larger than himself. And that's exactly what happened. Within a few months of his training at Fort Knox, he was on his way to Iraq. And within a week of arriving in Baghdad, he went out on a night patrol, and really a kind of freak explosion of a bomb sent a small piece of shrapnel through the very narrow opening under his helmet and killed him. He was 22. His father, Chris Froscheiser, is a remarkable man, did not really want his son to be in the Army, but supported him, had very mixed feelings about the war itself. He's a Democrat, but he's a kind of hawkish Democrat. He's a man who asks himself all the questions and seeks all the hard answers that those in the highest positions of power don't seem able to. Chris sent me a letter shortly after reading an article of mine in the New Yorker magazine about John Pryor. It turned out that Chris's son Kurt had served in the same battalion as John Pryor, and Chris was just looking for any connection he could find to his son's memory, to the men who had been with his son. You can imagine what it's like. Your child just disappears, is just sort of absorbed in this conflict on the other side of the world, with almost no communication, and then suddenly word comes that he's dead. And beyond the grief of the loss, you just want some sense of what it was like for him and what he was a part of. Chris wanted to be proud of Kurt. He was looking for any contact he could find with the last days of his son's life. And so he wrote me a letter. And that letter began a long correspondence by email that continues to this day between me and Chris. I went out to see him over Memorial Day weekend 2004 because I wanted to get to know him. I wanted to meet the rest of the family. I wanted to write about him. And he was willing, even grateful, to be written about because he wanted his son's memory to, in some way, to be sustained and for his death to be commemorated beyond the private ceremonies of the family. It was an intense weekend, I can tell you. Painful. Chris was still absolutely in the real heat of grief. Nothing had been scarred over. It was all raw. And I was suddenly found myself very much in the middle of his life and his emotions. And he's a man who kind of defies the Midwestern stereotype. He says everything. He voices all his emotions and his ideas. And for that reason, I found him to be just wonderful company and just a really admirable man. You can sort of see that the characters I was drawn to while I was writing about this war are the people I liked and admired. And in a way, the whole story is a story of admirable individuals who were, in a way, ill-served by those above them who had the responsibility and the power. Chris Froscheiser, to this day, continues to look for answers about why we went into Iraq and whether we should stay there in a way that's brave and honest and open that I find. I wish all of our citizens were a little more like him. I wish our leaders were more like him. I wish, as a country, we could have the kind of open, unafraid discussion about Iraq that Chris has within himself and with me all the time. He's really, in a way, a kind of throwback to a citizen, nonpartisan, patriotic, without being in the least bit harsh or divisive, that perhaps was more common 30, 40, 50 years ago. Anyway, I wrote about Chris in the Assassin's Gate at the very end of the book and about his son in order to talk about the effect of the war on the home front and on families, and in particular on this one family.
Chris, even in his deep questioning and his not letting himself take easy answers, he even says, I wonder what Bush in private thinks about being against nation building, and now he's waist deep in it. That's a question that I think that not just this one father of a soldier who died in Iraq has, but I think that most of us as citizens of this country are thinking about.
Well, Chris found himself dissatisfied with both the pro-war and the anti-war sides. He found the pro-war side, as he said, they don't have skin in the game. You know, it's easy to be for this war if you don't have a son in it. You know, if you don't have skin in the game, he would say, then you really better be careful about what you're telling other families they should do. And as for the anti-war side, he found that they didn't really respect his son's motivation for joining, and the fact that even though the war itself may be a debacle, the service of Kurt Froschheiser is honorable and gives meaning to his death. His death was not a waste. That's something that Chris insists on over and over again. I think it's important for him to feel that. So he feels a little isolated and disenchanted with the whole political argument about this war. He finds our country too polarized, too nasty and partisan, and for that reason too, because those are ideas that I share. He and I really connected over the years.
George, I wanted to wrap this up by, well, it's one of the moments in the book where George Packer shows up. I do think that the middle of the book, you are a fantastic observer, chronicler of what's going on around you, and you're also searching deep into not only the heart of the root causes of this war, but also getting to know certain very important people, and also people who no one else would know about other than your introduction. But here in the end, this is what you have to say.
I came to believe that those in positions of highest responsibility for Iraq showed an indifference to human life that amounted to criminal negligence, swaddled in abstract ideas, convinced of their own righteousness, incapable of self-criticism, indifferent to accountability. They turned a difficult undertaking into a needlessly deadly one. The Iraq War was always winnable. It still is. For that reason, the carelessness of its authors is all the harder to forgive.
George, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. This is Jason Molina talking to George Packer, the author of The Assassin's Gate, out in paperback right now on FSG. In the spirit of Studs Terkel, I have to leave you, George, with a hard one. George, when you left Iraq, what did you leave behind?
Well, certainly some illusions about both Iraq and my own country, and also a lot of hopes, because the tragedy of this war and of the story that I tell is that there were hopes. In fact, the hopes and dreams of millions of people, Iraqis and Americans, were riding on the fate of the war and the occupation. And today, Iraq is a nightmare of daily life. To be an Iraqi, to live in a place like Baghdad, is something very few of us could tolerate, and more Iraqis are trying to get out. It wasn't fate. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't because that's the kind of people they are. It wasn't inevitable. It was because of human decisions, human mistakes, which I've tried to chronicle. And those mistakes, and many of them were and continue to be willful in the face of obvious facts, have, for a long time to come, have dashed the hopes of people who have already suffered more than their share. And so when you ask what I've left behind a lot of love for the people who I got to know in Iraq, Americans and Iraqis. But I've also left behind some of the hopes that I went there with too, which have over the last 3 years sort of slowly dwindled. I can't give up on the place. I don't think we should give up on the place. I think we owe it to ourselves and to Iraq not to walk away, but to be realistic. We have to face that this is a debacle, and that it has been one that's come at a huge human price, and so it's an experience that I'll never forget and I'll never get over. It may be one that I'll continue to think about and write about for the rest of my life. It's been that big, that powerful, and that crushing an experience for me. It'll be with me always.
Thank you, George.